Hey, welcome back to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason. I serve as the senior pastor at Bridgeway, and we're excited that you're connecting with us. Hopefully you've had a chance before to see some of our other videos and teachings, and we hope those will be a blessing to you. In the year of 2024, we've been going through the Gospels. We've completed Matthew, we've completed Mark, and we find ourselves in this particular study right in the middle of the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke. And so we're going to be in chapter 14, 15, and 16 in this particular study. And I'm going to go ahead and take us over to that look. And so we are going to be starting tonight in Luke chapter 14, and it says, starting off, one Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. Now, that's an important thing because one of the components of Luke is that he regularly would give context. He'll regularly give context to what the atmosphere is before he depicts the event that unfolds. So we'll lean here in just a moment on some things about this particular invitation. But it says in verse 2, there in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. So that would have been a swelling, fluid swelling in the body. And Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him away. Now, a couple of things about just these opening verses for context. Now, if you're a regular at Bridgeway, we did a series through the summer of 2024 entitled The Storyteller. And in that, we were going through the parables of Jesus. And I'm just going to say a couple of things as though you weren't a part of that. Maybe you are just coming across our page, new with us maybe at Bridgeway, and you're unfamiliar with that series. So the idea of parables, the word parable comes from a Greek word called parabole. And the concept of it was to lay alongside of. So it would be the idea of a teacher who is teaching truth, and then they would lay a story right alongside of it. The story is not the emphasis. The story is to highlight the truth that's being pushed on. So we'll see that here in just a moment. But I did a talk around this particular occasion, this particular event in the life of Jesus that Luke records in chapter 14, and it was part 8 in that series. If you're looking back for it, and we'll put the link to it in the description below, but it was on August 4th, and the title of that talk was Choosing Seats. And so if you'd like to look back and see this kind of unpacked to its fullest dynamic, we'd love to have you listen to that. But for you, if you're new or as a refresher and you remember that message, a Pharisee would invite somebody to their house for one of three purposes. For the most part, it fell under one of three purposes. Number one, it was a measure of prestige. If a Pharisee had another traveling religious figure or a political figure or a military figure, somebody within the community of the Israelites that had any measure of notoriety, it was a prestigious, self-honoring thing to invite them to your house. We do this to this day. We watch dignitaries and politicians do that to this day. We watch celebrities do that to this day, where if I can have somebody prestigious in my house, it elevates my prestige. The second reason would be for an open, fair dialogue, and that could be on agreement or it could be with disagreement, but it was still an open, fair. There was a mutual respect. There was a mutual honoring of one another to simply dialogue about the topics at hand. It could be around the Mosaic Law, could be around the Jewish people and their condition. Or the third, and this is always the invitation that comes to Jesus by the Pharisees. It was for the purpose of correction or rebuke. To bring him into the house was to try to expose him and either correct his doctrine and theology, or to rebuke him, and not just privately, but before the following that was around him, the people that were garnered around Jesus. The correction and the rebuke was to try and separate Jesus from them and to reorient their status and authority. That absolutely is what's happening in chapter 14. Jesus is going to heal the man. And he is asking him this question about, is it lawful for a person to be healed on the Sabbath? And they're going to be quiet. The Pharisees, who were not experts in the law, they understood the law, but they were not the experts. The experts in the law, who were not Pharisees, two different groups of people, but who had same motive and agenda to have places of authority, keep Jesus lower. And they don't know how to answer him because he's asked this question to them before. There are a couple times where he pushes on them in the same manner. So they're silent to see what he'll do. Jesus is going to heal them. And then what's going to happen is he is going to lay into them a little bit about healing and helping on the Sabbath. And what's right? Is it right to heal and is it right to help on the Sabbath? They're not going to know how to answer. They're going to be quiet. And so Jesus is going to push on them about the seats that they chose. So that's where the title of the talk came in, about choosing seats, that he watches how they selected seats, and he's going to give them a parable about how they view themselves with an elevated, overinflated perspective. But once again, remember, parabole coming alongside of the truth. That was the parable. The truth is what he pushes on next. So watch this in verse 12. This is following the parable that he gives. Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. And this concept of repaid is a really important word. Like, who is it that you do your good for? Who is it that you do good for? Do you do it for the Lord? Do you do it for the people that are hurting? Or do you do it for your own self-recognition? And if you do it for self-recognition, you probably do it for people that can also kind of scratch your back. I'll scratch yours, you scratch mine. I'll like your post, you like my post. I'll follow you, you follow me. And he says, if you do, they may just simply give you back what you've done. But, verse 13, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, you'll be blessed from the Father. You will have makarios. It's a Greek word, makarios, which meant to have joy and to have happiness. But that's a Greek word. In the Jewish Hebrew concept, you would get into this word that meant to have the favor of God bent towards you. So it carried a whole different degree. And so what Jesus is saying is, if you will target and help people that can't help you in the same way, there will be a favor. There will be a blessing from the Lord. Although they cannot repay you, you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, this concept that you see here is going to carry on through all of our study today. It's going to carry on from chapter 14 to chapter 15 to chapter 16. You are going to see this same dynamic showing up in all three passages, or all three chapters, where Jesus is pushing against those who feel like they are in the lead. Jesus push against those who feel selected, better than, higher than, more pious, more righteous, more selected, compared to the people that feel less than, the people that feel marginalized, on the out. There's going to be terms like sinners and tax collectors, but that was an incredibly derogatory perspective. And Jesus is going to be highlighting this difference. So we're going to see it all throughout. From this, the conversation continues in verse 15. When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, Blessed is the man who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. Like, that sounds like a good kind of Pharisaical thing. Nothing against really the statement. The problem is that it's a self kind of almost promotion, like we're a part of that. And Jesus is going to lean once again on the concept that he just gotten through pushing. So Jesus replies, a certain man was preparing a great banquet, invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent a servant to tell those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. Now, let me just kind of set this up for just a second. This parable in this set of statements is directed, it's aimed right at the Pharisees. So imagine Jesus, he's been invited to a dinner on a Sabbath at a Pharisee's home for the intention of them correcting or rebuking him. He has healed them. He has watched the way they selected seats of priority. He has exposed that, but then he turns to the host, and to the host he says, you'd have been better favored by the Lord had you invited the poor, the lame, the crippled. And in this regard, some guy is indicating, it's going to be good for us to be at the eternal banquet, the kingdom of God banquet. And Jesus gives this parable about, so here's the deal, a banquet was held and these invitations went out. Pause. Jesus has already dealt with this a couple of times, and it is dealt with in the Old Testament, with the visual of there being a grand, eternal banquet meal with God, and that servants give invitation. The prophets are considered to be this. John the Baptist is considered to be this. Jesus is going to be the fulfillment. So Jesus will even give the one parable saying there's this great banquet and servants are sent, but they kill the servants. So the one hosting the banquet thinks, well, what I'll do is I'll send other servants, and they kill those servants. So then lastly he says, well, I'll send my son, because certainly they'll honor my son, but they end up doing the same to his son. Jesus is depicting that exact same scenario here. And this is pointed at the Pharisees. It's pointed at the religious type. And they're going to begin to make excuses about, in the parable, of why they can't come. Now, that once again, this is pointed at the Pharisees. A parable that sits alongside of a truth. In the parable, there's going to be excuses or reasons why they couldn't come. And the scenarios are that one bought a field and he has to go see the field. The other, he bought some farming elements, like he's got a oxen and he's got equipment and he's got to go check it out. Another, I just got married. And so there's going to be these excuses coming from those who were invited, from those that were selected. And then it's going to show the outcry or the disdain of the banquet host. It says, then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servants, go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And you'll remember that in this whole context that he has been pushing from the very beginning, how they selected seats, who's even invited, this self-inflation, this self-promotion. And Jesus is pointing this right at them. Now, continue to watch how this continues to develop, because he's going to now kind of turn the lens a little bit towards the disciples. He says something that has been very challenging and problematic for a number of people over the years, because what does he mean by this? So it says, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. And anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Now, if we're honest, there's a measure of difficulty with that. If we're honest, it's a bit confusing and challenging to kind of understand what Jesus is saying when he is depicting, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father or mother, does not hate his family, can't be my disciple. What is being depicted there? Well, there's some things that we have to understand about the teaching of Jesus here and his style. And so I want to show you a couple of things. Number one is that there was a very common way of ancient teaching that what they would do is pit one thing against the other. This might be, not the best of illustrations, but let's just say in present day, modern day. Let's say you have a parent and you have a teenager, and the teenager's, call it a little bit rebellious, does his own thing, wants to go his own way, and the parents are trying to, you need to do and you need to do, and it seems like the teenager just keeps defaulting to his own agendas or what his friends want him to do. And there's that old adage, you may have never used it, but you probably heard it, where somebody, a parent on TV or whatever, we brought you into this world and we can certainly take you out. That whole adage. We brought you in and we can take you out. What is being depicted? Two extremes. We were the reason you had birth, and we will use on the extreme, we could take your life. Is that what's really being pushed? No. The extremes are highlighting, we have authority in your life. So let's say the parent follows up with that and says, well, fine, let your friends take care of you, pay your insurance, pay your mortgage, pay your whatever. What are you doing there? You're pitting the friend versus the parent. Because in our modern day analogy, a teenager is making a set of decisions, making a life path, and we're pitting our advice as parents versus the friend's advice. And so you're pitting two things against one another. That was a very common practice in ancient teaching, certainly within Jewish rabbinical teaching from rabbis. So Jesus is doing that here. And then the second side is when he is leveraging the concept of hate. You have got to understand he is also inferring the concept of love. So anytime that Jesus would use hate, there was an inference of love. So let's say, for instance, you can't love two masters. You'll love one and hate the other, he says. You can't serve two masters. You'll find that love and hate on the two extremes, it just pushes you away from that. You'll have him say, of what was common in the day, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, and he'll go on to say, and hate your enemy. But then he'll say, but I say, love your neighbor as yourself. He'll pit these extremes. So there's one particular passage where it speaks in the scripture of God saying, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Did God hate Esau? Oh, that's a tall order. In the ancient practice, there was a pitting of extremes. So for the fact of Jesus to say, if anyone comes after me and he doesn't hate his father, mother, his family, his wife, his everybody, what he is depicting is love also. If he does not love me more. So let's think about that, because Jesus said that we're to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love is not just a feeling, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So let's lean on this. Love involves a variety of things. It's not just feeling. I just feel something. If you're married or you're a parent of kids, you know what I'm talking about, that love is not just solely a feeling. Sure, there are times that you have feelings, but there are also other times that you don't have feelings per se, but you operate and live in a certain way because you are entirely to your bones committed and you love even without feelings. So when following the Lord, there's feelings, certainly, but there's also listening. Who are we listening to? We're listening to his word. You think about the disciples. They feel something around him. They're called by him. They listen to his words. There's a response. In responding to the word of the Lord in their time or in our time, then we follow the Lord. In following the Lord, come on, we know this. In following the Lord, there's a measure of you where you just simply learn to trust and obey. Some things will make sense, some things won't make sense at all. Some things will work out how we want, some things won't work out at all. A disciple who loves Jesus, loves the Lord, and truly is a follower will have feelings, but will also listen to him, will respond, will follow even when following is difficult, will trust when trusting is difficult, will obey when obeying is difficult, will love the Lord. Just like the Lord to us, he doesn't love us just by feeling, but by full involvement. So when we come back to this passage and it says, if anyone comes after me and he doesn't hate all these other folks, it's inferring also the concept of love and the idea of who is it that you will listen to most? Who is it that you will respond to most? Who is it that you will follow the most? Who is it that you're going to trust the most? Who is it that you're going to obey the most? That becomes love. That becomes the mark of what discipleship truly is. From that, he's going to build off of, a couple of examples of counting the cost of what it is to be a follower. So he's going to use the example of someone wants to build a tower. He's going to consider the cost. If a king wants to go off to war, he's going to consider the cost. And Jesus then says in verse 33, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. Now, once again, what is he saying here? Is he saying that you have to leave home, you have to leave your job, you have to leave your clothing, you have to leave your car, you have to leave everything? No, it's still this concept against a backdrop of people that did a lot of self-inflation, a lot of overreaching on their own prestige, not paying attention to the people that God values. And Jesus is saying, if you won't love me and follow me and choose me above all things, you will lean in that direction. You will lean towards the same hypocrisy. But if you will learn from me and follow me and trust me and obey me, then you will be what is called a disciple, a follower. So he says this concept of where I become the one that you're listening to. I'm the one that you're following. I'm the one that you're trusting. I'm the one that you're obeying. That is a mark of love, so much so that in an ancient context, somebody could say that you hate everything else, where you might not have any hate at all in your heart, but it's that you love him to that degree that he takes priority on all these things. Well, from that, then we're going to continue into chapter 15 and start to capture even more of God's heart, the Lord's heart on this. It says, now tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. Pause. So that was a very derogatory concept. These aren't professions per se. Tax collector was a profession, but it was also like slang, so like we can have professions in our world and we use it like slang. So let's say, for instance, somebody's not giving you permissions at work and you call them a warden. You're just a warden, like this is a jail, or you might call somebody a judge, well, you're not my judge, you're taking a profession and you're using it in slang kind of concept. Well, tax collectors, what was that concept? They certainly had that profession, but it was a very derogatory perception of them. And Jesus is going to highlight that he cares for him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law didn't. Once again, if we take who's going to be a disciple, who's going to be a follower, really tough to listen to the words of Jesus, trust the words of Jesus, obey the words of Jesus, and hate the people that God loves. So it says, then Jesus told them this parable, and he's going to give 3 parables. The very famous lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. So verses 4 through 7 are going to be the parable of the lost sheep. And the context, we're not going to go through these verse by verse because takes so much time. I will highlight at the bottom in our Storyteller series, Pastor Joseph Harrison did a message called The Prodigal, where he touched on the entirety of this particular chapter and all three parables. And we'd love to have you go back and listen to it. It was delivered on July 28th, and I'll have a link at the bottom of the description also if you'd like to listen to that. But you know the context probably that the lost sheep is this 99, and there's a number of different angles that scholars kind of push on this, and probably all justifiable. But at its heart, you have in the parable a shepherd who has 100 sheep to his care, and one of them is missing. Whether by its own wandering, its own stupidity, it's whatever, one is missing. Now, in an ancient context in which a shepherd was financially liable for all of the sheep, there's penalty, there's payment, but that's not really the heart of the story. The heart of the story, what Jesus is laying this alongside of, is the degree that the shepherd will search for that lost sheep. And in this context, the shepherd finds this particular sheep and he is going to rescue, and there's going to be rejoicing that follows. The second story is going to be the one of the lost coin. And the concept of this woman inside the home, and she has these 10 coins, and one of them's missing. And she's trims her lamp, and she's down on the ground, and she's looking for everything and can't seem to find it. And then finally, when she does find it, there's great rejoicing. Now, I will say one thing about this that you might find to be interesting. Most scholars have an agreement about what is missing here. Don't just think about like a poor lady who has a little coin jar and all she had in her coin jar was 10 coins, and she emptied this coin jar and looked and there's only 9, and where did that other coin? There was something to some old ancient custom that kind of still carries over to this day, and that was in the ancient time period, women did not wear wedding rings. You didn't have a wedding ring like we do today. You know, a guy gets down on his knee and he proposes. He has the diamond ring that he could afford. He saved all his money and is very sentimental to him. Now, add to that, sometimes something is given to the daughter from a father. It's been kept in the family, so it has a tremendous amount of sentimental value because it's been in the family and now it's going to go to her. Imagine if something in the wedding ring or something in the family heirloom that was given to her now that she was going to be a bride, if that came up missing. Well, that would make sense in the search. So let me show you something. So this is just a modern day, kind of portrayal of this, but it was very common for ladies in the Arab world to wear headdresses, and they were called semidais, if I'm pronouncing that right. And you'll see on this particular, modern day version of this that there would be 10 coins along the headdress at the top. So the idea is to lose one of those coins. Now, that would be equivalent to losing your wedding ring. It would be equivalent to losing the family heirloom. So this isn't just talking about a lady who, now she can't get a Coke at the vending machine. She's lost something of sentimental family value. And for that reason, that's why there's such an arduous search and such rejoicing when she finds it. Last thing to that is, in the ancient context, for a woman to not have all her coins was very belittling of her. It was a disgraceful thing to not have your coins if you were pledged or you were married. It's like you lost your covenant or you lost your purity. So this is way bigger than just a coin in a coin jar. But then you get to the parable of the lost son, and this is commonly referred to as the prodigal son, and you know the storyline of that. If we leaned on it, it would take, probably 45 minutes for us to unpack the whole thing. What I would pull off of Luke 15 is keep in mind what was happening in Luke 14, the dinner that Jesus is invited to, the fact that he is dealing with people that have a self-inflation. They choose the highest seats. Jesus says you have no regard for the poor and the lame and the crippled. He's going to give some parable about that to the disciples. He's going to say, if you want to be my disciple and you don't want to be amongst this group, if you want to be my disciple, it's going to have to look as though you hate all other things. You're going to have to choose my way above all things. He's going to come out of that. He's going to be in the fellowship of tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees are going to oppose him like they were earlier. Jesus is going to launch into 3 parables highlighting this idea that something was tremendously valued. There was an extensive search or watch for, and then there was great rejoicing when it was recovered. There was something of tremendous value. The shepherd valued the sheep. The lady valued not just the coin, but what it represented. She valued her family or her integrity and purity. She valued the family heirloom. She valued what it was connected to. The father valued the son amidst all that had transpired. And there was some form of exhaustive either search or watch. The father watched, and we could get into the Hebrew culture and concept of what was called a kezizah, where somebody who left would have a very difficult time coming back home. And I believe the father was trying to keep the kezizah from happening to where the son could get home. And so he's watching. And then there's rejoicing upon return or upon being found. Now, that whole concept of how God views the despondent or the marginalized or the lost, I think carries over into chapter 16. So chapter 16 has 2 primary highlights, and the 2 primary highlights that we'll see are what are called the parable of the shrewd manager and then the rich man and Lazarus. So Luke 16 is going to finish like as a broken record about all that we've talked about. So we have this shrewd manager parable. So Jesus told his disciples, there's a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Now let's pause. I'm going to just paraphrase what comes next. So this manager has wrongly appropriated things that weren't his. And in this parable, he is going to start to scheme. He is going to say between verse 3 and 7, he's going to say, I'm not cut out for manual labor. I'm not cut out for different forms of work. If I lose this job, what will I do? He's very troubled, and so he comes up with a shrewd plan to call all the people, all the vendors who owe money to his owner, and basically, let's say, cuts their debt in half. Cuts their debt, gives them a discount, so that, couple things, so that they are complicit to his business management. Number 2, so that he can draw upon their favor should he find himself jobless. So it's pretty understandable just at face value. But it doesn't make sense why Jesus would give this kind of parable until later, something he's going to say. It says in verse 8, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. So pause here. So once again, this doesn't make sense why Jesus would come off of what he's come off of, the most famous parable of all time. And then from this parable about a shrewd manager and what does he mean here? And almost commending the guy who had stolen for his shrewdness, until you push into what he says next. So he says this next in verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? So let's lean on that. Let's absorb that in the context of what we've studied. So Jesus suddenly is not really talking about money, he's talking about people. He's not really talking just about people, he's talking about what God values and what God searches after. So if you haven't been trustworthy with business finances, who would trust you with more? You read that parable, you hear that parable, you dial in with that. But then he takes it another step and he says, if you haven't been trustworthy with somebody else's property, who's going to entrust you with property? This brings in the reality of recognizing that God has entrusted us positions of leadership. God has entrusted us positions of opportunity. God has entrusted us with opportunity to make a difference in people that he would search after. And if you are not trustworthy with what he values, then how can you ever think that he will entrust you with more? Now, once again, two different groups of people, disciples, and we'll call them the pious, religious, Pharisees, experts in the law, the pious group. He is leaning on them of they think they have the favor of God because they dress well or they have authority or because they're in positions. And Jesus is saying that doesn't mean a thing because you don't value what the Father values. To the disciples, he's trying to raise their perspective of recognizing the significance of valuing who God values. The Pharisees are going to just push against this entirely. So watch what happens. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. Pause. Pharisees were not novices to parables. They wouldn't have sat in this study that you and I are doing and me say parabole, something that lays alongside of it, and the Pharisees had been like, wow, I've never heard that before. They're experts. They were masters at this. They knew exactly that Jesus was targeting them in what is valued and what is not valued. And so it identifies that they had a love for something that was not God and was not people. They had started off maybe that way, but it had become something very, very different. The person who got hired in the parable, metaphorically, didn't start off maybe as a scoundrel and a thief, but became that with the access and proximity to the capacity of stealing. And same thing for Pharisees. It didn't start off with the scoundrel nature, but would have maybe devolved that way. And there's a real strong warning that's there in this. And so much so that they recognize, and so they're very angry, sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourself in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. So you value where you sit, Luke chapter 14. You value the company you're in, prestige. You value all these different things, and God is repulsed by it. He values people, whether they are of any economic sort. He values people in whatever concept or struggles they might find themselves in. But you turn your nose up towards that. And you think that you're better selected and they are inferior. From that concept, then he's going to finish out this chapter. And he's going to say, so there's a rich man was dressed in purple, fine linen, lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. I mean, that's a guy that's in bad shape and can't move. Like a person that has dogs around him that are licking these wounds and the guy can't push them off or get away. It's hard days for that guy. The time came when the beggar died. The angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And then Jesus is going to unapologetically, mind you, unapologetically point to a destination for both. In hell, where he was in torment, being of the rich man who died and was buried, in hell where he was in torment. That's Jesus talking. That's harsh. He is making no apologies. He is not sending out a retraction letter off of this. And he says he looked up and saw Abraham. That would be Abraham of Genesis, the book of Genesis. Father Abraham had many sons. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the one of promise. Looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. Unapologetically, Jesus says there are two people, had different lots in life. One was rich, and boy, did he like his richness. One was hard, poor, suffered a lot. It was looked over. They both died and they both ended up in very different places. One in heaven, one in hell. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue because I am in agony in this fire. And it says in verse 25, but Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your time you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Now, there's a couple more statements that are going to be made, but I'm going to pull off of the study with that and close out our time together. You take Luke chapter 14, 15, and 16, and you see a totality of it. Sometimes it is fantastic to study the scripture by zeroing in on the statement, pull out words. What does the word mean? What did it carry? The concept. There's also times that it's advantageous to pull back and say, what is the full dynamic and the full context of this? I think when you see Luke chapter 14, followed by 15, followed by 16, and the continuity of this theme, it makes a lot of sense. And there's also a sobering call for us as to if you and I are going to be disciples, followers of Jesus, that we will love him in such a way that some people might try and classify that we hate other things. And it's not that we hate other things, it's that we have chosen and follow and love him. And that's not just by how we feel. That's not just by what we've listened to. That's how we're responding. It's how we're following. It's how we're trusting. It's how we're obeying. The totality of what love involves, to love him with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, involves all these components. And it might look like, in some regard, like you hate or disregard, you prioritize him above everyone and everything, that he truly is the one that you follow. And if you do that, you will watch what he values, and you will notice that he is not metaphorically at a dinner trying to pick the best seat. He is looking for who has been invited and why there aren't some poor and some lame and some crippled. Why are there some people that otherwise couldn't have repaid? Why aren't there some people here that could have never invited themselves? Why are people not being valued? Because God values them. And because you might get gray on that, here's some parables of a lost sheep and a lost coin means something very sentimental in the family. A lost son that is at the heart of the family. And then coming off of that with, a depiction of, if you can't be trusted with little, you won't be trusted with more. If you aren't entrusted, or if you're not faithful with the heart of the Father with this, whatever this is in your life, how can you think that you'll be trusted with that, which will be more? Let it be that we don't see ourselves like the rich man and looking down upon the Lazarus who is struggling. Let it be that we have the eyes of the Father towards people, that we look towards people the way Jesus does. That is our aim. That is our aspiration. And many times we'll fall short, but it's not where we're going to stop. We're going to keep on pressing to listen to his words, to respond to his words, to follow him, to trust him, to obey him, to feel his heart towards people and towards things, that we might truly love him with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind and strength. I hope that this has been an encouragement for you as we've studied Luke 14, 15, and 16. And as always, I hope you'll take it way beyond what we've even had time to do today. So God bless you, and I'll see you for the next part.